it might have been a warning to Poland. He was on his way to Poland, and Poland is a state right up against Russia, and they've been putting pressure on Poland as they have in all the other Balkan states. Right. For a long time now, and I think it's probably part of that general approach to being difficult and saying, here we are, watch out.
Russia is believed to have jammed the satellite signal on an RAF aircraft carrying Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, back from Poland in what's been described as a wildly irresponsible act of electronic warfare. The GPS signal was interfered with for around 30 minutes while the jet flew close to Russian airspace over the Baltic Sea. Mobile phones could no longer connect to the internet, and the aircraft was forced to use alternative methods to determine its location. Well, earlier I spoke to Sir Michael Graydon, former Chief of Air Staff at the RAF, to ask him what he thought had happened.
I'm only going on report. Quite clearly, I've got no, as it were, formal information, so I'm just going on experience in this field of jamming and disturbing the electronic world. I mean, in the Cold War, we used to get a lot of jamming from the then Soviet Union, and we learned quite a lot about their capabilities in that process. And interestingly, at the time, we were aware that what we were seeing was a very small part of their general capabilities. So the Soviets, let's now talk about the Russians, are very strong in this area. And in those days, it was jamming of radars and radio frequencies, all of which would have made life very difficult in a war. And we had to work on ways to mitigate that, which we had, although it would never have been the same as having a free space. So it doesn't surprise me that the GPS, which of course is relatively new in this field, is now part of the target. And so what happened today or yesterday, whenever it was, is no surprise to me. And it is quite possible to affect it.
Right.
And if
so
you were in the Baltic, sorry, just 1 point, if I
yeah,
may.
Please.
If you were in the Baltic states, Sweden, Finland, and so on, you've been subjected to this sort of activity year on year on year from the Russians. So the fact that the Defence Secretary was en route to Poland, I gather, and this has happened to him, doesn't surprise me in the least.
So what does it actually do? If you jam somebody's GPS, you interfere with an aircraft's GPS, what does that actually do?
Well, it all depends what other capabilities you've got on board. I mean, certainly when I was flying in the sort of jets that he would have been flying in, we didn't actually have GPS. It wasn't until later that was introduced, and so we relied on bearings from different things in different countries, and various sort of inertial systems, which were actually quite adequate for the flying of ordinary passenger-type aircraft from A to B. GPS introduced a level of information which was transformational in many ways, but nevertheless, there are plenty of other ways in which you can work your way along the airways. So I wouldn't be too concerned about, as it were, all air transport in the civil world is going to come to a stop as a result of this.
No,
because there are other ways.
So help me understand that then, Sir Michael, because if, as you say, sort of blocking or sort of jamming the GPS signal isn't necessarily going to be the end of the world for that aircraft, it'll find other ways to navigate its way to where it was going. What's the point? What was the aim here?
Well, you might ask, what was the point of them jamming and interfering with radio and other signals in the Baltics for all these years?
Exactly.
It's a part of Russian pressure. It's saying, here we are, big Mother Russia, and we're capable of doing this. Beware, take us seriously. And I think there's probably just another example of that. I mean, some of these people who are organizing this are probably not the brightest in the world. Whether they really think it through and decide that this is an important time to do it, I doubt. they probably are told, every now and then you've got to do this, and so they did it.
Right. So far as the sort of aircraft is concerned, a Dassault 900 LX Falcon jet, as we understand it, would it have been safe enough to be carrying the Defence Secretary?
Well, I think in normal cases, yes. It may well have. I don't know what other capabilities got on board, but normally we would provide certain capabilities to, for example, flares and things like that against surface-to-air missiles. I mean, that's an extreme. But certainly I know that was introduced to some of our airplanes at some stage. I mean, something that's probably just worth making clear to your listeners is that there are military satellites and civil satellites. And the military satellites, which would not have been ones that are being used on this occasion, are much more secure than the civil ones.
Right. Is there any reason for them to have targeted Grant Shapps specifically?
That's a really good question. I don't know. Were other aircraft in the vicinity affected? I would have thought almost certainly yes. So did they know it was him? I don't know. But if they did, they certainly got the attention that perhaps they wanted or didn't want. I don't know.
Right. So you feel that this could have been a more sort of broad manoeuvre that actually just happened to catch the Defence Secretary in its path?
Well, I think in a way it might have been a warning to Poland. He was on his way to Poland, and Poland is a state right up against Russia, and they've been putting pressure on Poland as they have in all the other Balkan states
right.
for a long time now. And I think it's probably part of that general approach to being difficult and saying, "Here we are, watch out."
Right. I mean, is there? Do the UK need to take a stance on this? Is there something that needs to be said? I mean, ultimately, whether it's a serious risk or otherwise, the Defence Secretary was put at risk. His aircraft was altered in some way. How serious is that?
I'd be more inclined to make it on a general point. I mean, doing that sort of thing, which will affect a number of other airplanes, a lot of other airplanes, I would have thought, in the area at the time, is really a pretty appalling thing to do, isn't it? But then that's Russia today.
And is there an argument? Because I mean, the very interesting quote in the Times piece on this tonight from Dr. Thomas Withington, who is an associate professor, a fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. He says that what Russians are trying to do here is to protect their own assets in these areas, effectively, primarily protecting their sort of deployments and bases and troop concentrations and even some of the strategic targets within Russia against satellite-navigated guided weapons. So there's sort of another argument here, which is that so much as this is sort of showing their might and their strength and perhaps even trying to disrupt this aircraft, they are also attempting to protect themselves against GPS-used, GPS-controlled weapons. Is there any merit in that?
I think that's a rather different issue to the one we've seen today. I mean, clearly they will be concerned about the guidance capabilities of weapons, as you've described. But we need to go back to where as I mentioned earlier, there's the military satellites and there's the civilian satellites. So if they were, as it were, frightening us of their capabilities to deal with the civil satellites, then I think they probably missed the target, because we have the military satellites, which I hope are much more secure.
Right. Okay. So just because you don't feel that it is likely to have been something, a mistake during an act of self-defense.
In Russia, nothing surprises.
Fair enough. And
could have been a cock up.
And just finally, Sir Michael, is there another sort of broader point to be made here? There was some stories last week about Liz Truss and a trip that she made to Australia via a private jet. Some suggesting that she should have taken a commercial jet. It would have been a shorter route. There was one available to her out of Heathrow into Australia, where she was going. The same can be said about Rishi Sunak quite regularly. We talk about his travel a lot, don't we, as he tries to get himself around via private helicopter, etc. Do we sort of need to take a breath here and accept that our leaders and those in positions of power do need to be protected, or is that an overstretch?
It's an interesting point. I mean, given the circumstances, and it's a pretty dire situation at the moment with Russia, I would be certainly looking at greater protection for our leaders if they are in the vicinity of Russia. I mean, going to Australia, frankly, I don't think that's an issue. And going westwards, I don't think that's an issue. But operating in or around the area that Russia seems to think she owns is one that I think probably does need a little bit more thought.
Sir Michael Graydon, former Chief of Air Staff at the RAF, speaking to me earlier. There's more on that in your copy of The Times tomorrow. More insight and analysis as to what exactly happened to Grant Shapps' aircraft.